we must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McCarron.
And this is Jeremy Rothe Kushel.
All right, we're back with our follow-up from last show where we discussed the arrest of FBI counterintelligence head, former Charlie McGonigal, and we're going to get into Chapter 4 of Proof of Conspiracy to get back into elements of 2016 and 11/9. But first, we wanted to provide an update on the events surrounding the McGonigal arrest and another oligarch who McGonigal has a you can say significant connection to, in addition to Oleg Deripaska, which has received a majority of the attention, I would say understandably. But there's another player in the picture here who also is of significance, to say the least.
Yes, and this is Vladislav Doronin, is this other Russian sphere oligarch who McGonigal was working for. Now, this is more recent, it looks like, than his contract or relationship with Deripaska, but it comes in basically spring of last year, spring of 2022, when he hooks up with Doronin's company, Aman Real Estate, and acts as in a similar position, by the way, that he did for Brookfield Real Estate, which is the infamous company that helped Jared Kushner and the family finance the 666 Avenue, or I forget which street it was on, the 666 property. And there's a whole background there that will include links to that tell the timeline of that and how it relates to the potential courting of Anbang, Chinese banking investment.
666 Fifth Avenue.
Fifth Avenue, right. Thank you. And then also how apparently Kushner uses his position in the Trump administration to leverage the Qataris and their sovereign wealth fund to come through to save them while he's in the government. Right? Remember, one of the main overt flashing red lights of the Trump administration was the emoluments questions and all the family that was working for him, and including all the way up to Donald Trump himself, the entanglements, these investment entanglements that would have destroyed any earlier presidency before it even happened. I would think. But then you go look, okay, McGonigal, key character in the apparent cover-up of the 11/9 operation, Trump-Russia, and the expansion into the Middle East, and all of that, helping limit the hangout of the investigation from early on, it would seem to be the case. Now, what's interesting here, too, is this then the Doronin connection. He's been described as like the Russian James Bond billionaire type, and now he apparently renounced his citizenship during the Soviet Union, I think in like 1986-ish, somewhere in there, and is said to have recently given up all of his connections to the Russia in terms of his financial dealings, but it looks like that's not the case, that he's basically handed over things to his mother in terms of operating inside of Russia. And then this then directly ties back into Epstein Maxwell, right? And remember this epicenter here, McGonigal sending to head of counterintelligence and aspects of cyber in relationship to the New York field office of the FBI. And this New York epicenter is crucial, obviously, when you bring in people like Giuliani, but then you bring in people like Epstein operating out of his Wexner gifted, most expensive brownstone, apparently, in all of Manhattan, probably the most expensive real estate in the world, maybe. And have all these cameras and audio surveillance operations, a whole room of video, audio, visual surveillance having been already set up in the brownstone by Les Wexner before it was then handed over to Epstein to operate from. And what's very interesting here, too, is the direct Epstein connection. Remember, we talked when we started getting into the question of from 9/11 to 11/9, we started pointing out and we started talking about Trump's ground zero and an unlucky Larry Silverstein in the run up to the acquiring by Silverstein and Lowy, mainly Westfield Mall, of the quote unquote privatization by people like Ronald Lauder of the Port Authority of the World Trade Center to these groups in the immediate run up to September 11th, that we started pointing out that there was a brownstone right next to Jeffrey Epstein that was owned by a Howard Lutnick, right? And Howard Lutnick was the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, which was, was the major target, it looks like, if you were thinking about it as sort of targeting of the World Trade Center. And they lost almost all of the people in those buildings. And all the stories are written up about Howard Lutnick in terms of his luck in bringing his son to his first day of kindergarten that day, and that's how he missed this event where even his own brother and all hundreds and hundreds of his employees died on September 11th. So there was always that connection. Now, we then also delved into, and by the way, this is the Howard Lutnick of Cantor Fitzgerald, which is now a major player in the so-called alternative media platform Rumble, where all these so-called alternative investigators, including former colleagues like Kevin Barrett and False Flag Weekly News and all of that, have found their freedom of speech voice there. Right now, I wonder whether people have actually dealt with the question of Lutnick and Cantor Fitzgerald and 9/11 on the Rumble media platform and see where that goes. That'd be interesting to test out. But you have things like, in last fall in September, big press release. It's even linked on Cantor's website. I'll just quote the press release from Rumble and CFVI, right? That's Cantor Fitzgerald. September 13th, 2022, New York. Quote, Chris Pavlovsky, CEO of Rumble, Inc., Rumble, the fast-growing neutral video platform, spoke with Howard W. Lutnick, CEO of CF Acquisition Corp. 6, NASDAQ CFVI, a publicly traded special purpose acquisition company sponsored by Cantor Fitzgerald. And they have a whole friendly interview and all of that. And Lutnick has, talked about how he has moved on from the tragedy of September 11th and how difficult it has been and all of that. So we'll see if any of the 9/11 investigators find out that they are sort of on a platform apparently sponsored by both Jeffrey Epstein's immediate neighbor. Remember all the questions of tunnels and underground connections and all that, but his immediate neighbor. And also this, one of the guys who, like Lucky Larry Silverstein, missed the big 9/11 event for good luck, right? So this is one piece. But there's this other important real estate connection here that we were exploring at that time of Trump's ground zero and from 9/11 to 11/9. And this is the figure of Howard Lorber. And he is a big real estate guy, and he actually was a crucial part of the catalyzing Donald Trump's trip to Moscow in terms of potential real estate production in Russia and all of that. And the connection here to Doronin, McGonigal's maybe most recent employer, is that Doronin started a company called OKO Group. And by the way, there's a lot of sort of occultic symbology in a lot of this, as we'll get into, too. That the word oko means eye in Proto-Slavic, and the name expresses Doronin's vision. This is from the OKO Group Wikipedia. But his CEO, Doronin's CEO of the OKO Group, it's in his American-based company, headquartered in Miami, Florida, by the way, is a woman named Vanessa Grout, who comes directly. She was a CEO of South Florida real estate brokerage Douglas Elliman. And Douglas Elliman. Vanessa Grout was appointed CEO of Douglas Elliman, Florida by Howard Lorber, chairman of Douglas Elliman Realty and CEO of Vector Group Limited. Through its real estate arm, New Valley LLC, Vector Group owns Douglas Elliman Realty, the largest residential brokerage company in New York. So there is a direct connection to 11/9 and the Trump ground zero in all of this that comes out of the Doronin connection with McGonigal. Now, there's more to this, too, because there's more Epstein here, too, because it was Doronin, first of all, was had as his girlfriend Naomi Campbell for a while, and Josh Reeves. Well, I'll just remind people of this really crucial video that Josh Reeves in the summer of 2019 titled Naomi Campbell's Birthday Party, Bombshell Jeffrey Epstein Information, pointing out, starting actually in a certain way with Joe Rogan talking about this party at this mega house that he went to in the Hollywood Hills, invited by Dave Chappelle, where it was Naomi Campbell was sort of naked body, was in this massive 50-foot banner when they got up there. And it turns out that this is at the same time that Campbell's involved with Doronin, and Doronin rented this house. This is the Chemosphere, which is one of the most prominent experimental modern houses, especially in LA, designed by John Lautner. It's in a lot of Hollywood movies. And then back to the symbology of all this, right? It looks like a UFO. It looks like a disc, right? Like the classic alien spacecraft from the 1950s onward is what the Chemosphere looks like, overlooking all of LA. And then Doronin then had also built Naomi Campbell her own house in, I believe it was in somewhere in Russia or close by, maybe right next door. And it also looks like some kind of spacecraft of some sort, but it also looking down, and I believe maybe this is then Doronin's house himself, his own house, looks like the eye of Horus. So you go back to the OKO and the eye and all of that. And then final little piece of this is that this Aman group that McGonigal worked for, that owned by Doronin, had previously, and I believe this is before Doronin acquired it, I think, but it was the Aman Group was the one that an architect had been involved in leading the renovation of Jeffrey Epstein's quote-unquote Lolita Island, the little St. James and the St. Virgin Islands. So there is a tightening sphere here that includes questions of 9/11, 11/9, Epstein, Maxwell, that is really sort of right below the surface here in terms of just the surface level facts of what we know about McGonigal's arrest and apparent compromat by these networks.
Yes, and you were referring to this house in the suburbs of Moscow, and it's interesting. The only result for Doronin and the Chemosphere, which I was able to find on Google, was a link to the CBS News article from 2015, which described houses that looked like spaceships, and one of them was the Chemosphere, where these parties took place that Joe Rogan was mentioning about his relation to attending with Dave Chappelle, and then also this other house in the suburbs of Moscow that was specifically commissioned by Vladislav Doronin to be built for his then significant other, Naomi Campbell, was indeed in the suburbs of Moscow, and that was commissioned in 2006.
All right, very good. And remember the direct connection that we didn't say before in terms of Naomi Campbell and Epstein is that she was part of the rings, really, right? There's the tons of photographs. There's especially photographs of Virginia Giuffre, key Epstein Maxwell accuser and victim of that network when she was at some of these parties underage. These are Naomi Campbell's right in the mix there, right? And then there is this infamous photo of Naomi Campbell with Donald Trump and Ghislaine Maxwell and Melania Trump. And so these are very tight circles in many ways. And so then this then hints. One last thing we need to make clear is this Brookfield connection. Is McGonigal worked in a very similar kind of position that he worked for Doronin's Aman. And by the way, notice the name Aman, right? It could relate to Aman Jordan. It could relate to Aman, the Israeli military intelligence that someone like key Epstein associate Ehud Barak was the head of Israeli military intelligence, in addition to being a prime minister and defense department chief and all of that. So Oman is maybe also there's some symbology there in terms of the name of that. I'm not sure, but Brookfield, this is the same position that McGonigal, this compromised FBI counterintelligence cyber investigator, key in the Trump 11/9 operation, in quote unquote investigation, had the same position. He was a vice president and head of security for Brookfield, and then becomes the head of security for Doronin's Aman, a global real estate company. And then, Greg, there's this other potential tie in here. Maybe what we'll do is just read a few little pieces from Craig Unger's book, American Kompromat: How the KGB Cultivated Donald Trump and Related Tales of Sex, Greed, Power, and Treachery. Because if there's these two sort of names in the New York real estate financial circles that Trump was, well associated with, those are the two Howards, right? You got Howard Lutnick, that's Cantor Fitzgerald, Rumble guy, right? Independent media guy, I guess, right? You got Howard Lutnick, Jeffrey Epstein's long neighbor. And then you have Howard Lorber, who's the real estate guy, right? And then in this Russian sphere, when you're really talking about these deep connections to questions about Epstein Maxwell, what is the nature of the compromat? This is the key question that has not been answered, is where are the audio visual tapes that were part and parcel of decades long compromise operations via this entire sphere, Epstein back to Wexner, back to, the even older groups that were part of setting people up and film and recording them and compromising them. That goes even back to questions of Meyer Lansky and J. Edgar Hoover, but of course Roy Cohn at the epicenter of this. But where are those audiovisual tapes? Everyone sort of makes a big deal of the list. Where's the so-called John list of the Epstein Maxwell compromise network? But even more importantly, where are the compromat materials? Who has them? Who's pictured on them? We've seen almost nothing. The little bit that we that we are alleged to have seen comes from a former Florida sheriff's deputy, Dougan, John Mark Dougan or Mark Dougan, and he ends up in Russia meeting with this other key Russian sphere oligarch billionaire type, Pavel Borodin. So in the American sphere, you have the Howards, Lutnick, and Lorber. In the Russian sphere, you have Pavel Borodin and Vladislav Doronin. So Doronin and Borodin. And so we're just going to get into a little bit of this background in terms of Trump and Lorber, but also just a key piece about if there's another key guy involved in Department of Justice activities surrounding the obvious cover up of the 11/9 Operation Trump Russia and beyond, you got to say it's not just Rod Rosenstein. It is William Barr, Bill Barr, right? So we're going to get into this real quickly. And
All right,
then,
that sounds
yeah.
good. And thank and real quick, just to finalize that segment there on Doronin and the stuff surrounding Naomi Campbell and what could link it back to Epstein, and then ultimately closer to Donald Trump would be the relationship between these people and someone like John Casablancas, the now deceased modeling agency executive who was once employed Naomi Campbell at her, I believe, the beginning of her rise to fame, and Casablancas' relationship with Donald Trump, and even then extending into a man who claimed that he introduced Donald and Melania Trump, a man by the name of Paolo Zampalli. So that's another thing I want to throw in there that could probably be talked about more in another show, but that is also at play here, and that would link further into bringing it closer to the bigger picture with Trump, Epstein, and all of the multinational intrigue, not just Russian, but going in a more of a multinational direction with even as it relates to the events surrounding this McGonigal arrest and some of his interest, and then also the bigger picture of what we've been talking about for the last several years in relation to all of this. So there's some high fashion connections there that never get mentioned by the Trump. Just simply tried to expose Epstein and never did anything off the straight and narrow with regards to that relationship. So I just want to throw that in there.
That's a good point, and of course, there's also competing claims or narratives of who it was that introduced Trump to Melania. Epstein has put in his bid to have been that guy too. But the most important part of this is that exactly what you brought up, this question of modeling, of elite modeling, and the fashion industry, right? That's what you really see at the epicenter of this. All even then you include Jean-Luc Brunel, his role in all of this, and it's clear, right? That's Melania comes up through this at this very interesting intersection of modeling and call girls might be one way of thinking about it, but then underneath the surface, obviously, is the question of what's not. Which is the real dark underside of this, which is child trafficking, child rape, and all of that, right? Because remember the contextual allegations surrounding Katie Johnson, Jane Doe's accusations on the record. On the legal record in the run up to the 2016 election against Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, was that she was brought to Epstein's home where Donald Trump was under the guise of this is your way to make it into the fashion industry, to become a model, to become an actress, and all of that. And so this is the way that the grooming and the cultivation of a situation where a teenage girl like Katie Johnson was, alleges that she was raped by people like Epstein and Trump, and then she says threatened by Trump, and then she says also threatened when she was making these allegations public in the run up to the 2016 election, and then withdraws because she had threats against her and her family. Right, and so that's the piece of this that is crucial is the way that the modeling industry, and all of that is sort of a cover for all of this. All right, let's just briefly read from bottom of page 255 of Craig Unger's American Kompromat. How the KGB cultivated Donald Trump and related tales of sex, greed, power, and treachery. And this will deal with Barr, and then we'll just quickly go back to just fleshing out some of the surrounding details of where is the actual audiovisual Kompromat material in relationship to Dougan and then Borodin, Russia, and Putin, really. All right. At the bottom, quote, when it came to Russia, however, Barr, this is Bill Barr, Barr too had Russian ties. In his financial disclosure report, Barr noted that he received between $5,001 and $15,000 in dividends from the Vector Group, a company that had strong links to Russia and whose president, Howard Lorber, accompanied Trump on a 1996 trip to Moscow that attempted to get a Trump Tower Moscow project underway. Similarly, Barr held between $100,000 and $250,000 in assets in Deutsche Bank. Unquote. By the way, remember, Deutsche Bank, key epicenter, right, of all of this, 11/9, Epstein. Deutsche Bank gets its origins in financing Auschwitz, and then in the more contemporary era, it becomes a key locus of global Russian money laundering. The scandal that was known as the Russian laundromat, look that up. And then also being not only key Donald Trump financer, but also Jeffrey Epstein's one of his main go-tos for moving his money around. So, and there's also a piece of this that then links into the current situation in Israel-Palestine. Remember, of the after the FinCEN files came out. That's the Department of Treasury Financial Crimes Investigations Unit. It came out that what was then known as Israel's most wealthy citizen, Roman Abramovich, key guy globally, key Putin ally, origins in the gang wars that represented the post-Soviet Russian landscape, the whole aluminum wars and all of that. Roman Abramovich becomes a key a donor via money that's held in these Deutsche Bank networks to it's really an ethnic cleansing operation under guise of tourism and lawfare in Israel Palestine, specifically in terms of Jerusalem. And I did a whole show interview with Richard Silverstein about the background of some of these Russian oligarchs, including Roman Abramovich, who financed this Jerusalem-based organization to the tune of almost, I think, over $100 million, almost 10 years of seed startup money for this organization that has led the way in terms of out using sort of immoral and very likely illegal in terms of international law lawfare against Palestinians who have had their homes there for many, many, many generations, and pushing them out in order to further ethnically cleanse that area for Israel. So that's Roman Abramovich, and so there. Maybe I can find the link to my interview with Silverstein that also has the links to those stories there. So that's Deutsche Bank in terms of Barr, and then just finishing up this paragraph here at the bottom of page 255 of American Kompromat by Craig Unger in the chapter titled "Barr Justice." Quote, similarly, Barr held between $100,000 and $250,000 in assets in Deutsche Bank. In 2018, he resigned from the board of Oak Ziff, OCH ZIFF Capital Management, whose management had run afoul of the Kremlin. And of course, he was counsel at Kirkland and Ellis, which handled Russia's Alpha Bank. Unquote. That's the end of that little piece. And then I just want to get back an earlier chapter, the question of Pavel, Borodin, and Dougan. Because this is really this is the edge of what we've been alleged to have seen from who has the Kompromat material. And Dougan said he had it, he left the country with it, and we've seen very little, if any, of it. There was one, maybe a couple things that he released. Now, Unger said that he actually saw some of this. It was difficult to tell who it was and all of that. And so obviously then there's got to be a question, right, of FBI, DOJ. They must have some access to this material, this Kompromat material too. And but it's not just them potentially. And so I want to look into that.
And Dougan, it looks like from what there is publicly, he said very little's been released, but it appears like from things I've seen that Dougan and what he seems to be more pointing in the direction of Prince Andrew as it relates to the Epstein operation, which we've talked about as being, or Maxwell Epstein operations. We talked about with Prince Andrew in some ways being as as guilty as the evidence points towards him being, like, is a way for other people to all the attention around the royals and all that intrigue does kind of serve as a way to shield other people from similar scrutiny. And then Dougan also has his blog Bad Volk, Badvolk, where he has been promoting pretty extensively over especially at the beginning of the Ukraine war, the invasion of Ukraine, the biolabs theory of the West set up biolabs for use for warfare against Russia, which was the justification for the invasion. So that's Dougan.
And I don't remember if we mentioned this on the antidote, but I mentioned this to you, Greg, when we were talking about this background of Dougan, especially in terms of what you just brought up here, his actual public role post-Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that he also played. I saw him on major YouTube clips of being interviewed by major foreign media and acting as a apparent representative of the Russian government in describing their geopolitical justification and reasons for invading Ukraine. So it appears that this guy has now been escalated to a frontman, a Russian state frontman spokesperson in the wake of him going to Moscow and, as we'll see now, apparently meeting with a key Russian figure, both involved in government and big real estate, and also maybe a key godfather to Putin, it looks like. So there's massive geopolitics involved in all of this, in this connection. All right, now we're back on page 224 of Unger's American Kompromat. And this has described Dougan's background a little bit in Florida, and now it's describing how he then gets to Moscow in Russia. Quote, okay. But he also published loads of disinformation and accusations about Sheriff Rick Bradshaw and other PBSO, Palm Beach Sheriff's Office brass, including a fake pedophilia confession that appeared under the fraudulent byline of a top department official. Meanwhile, Dougan had struck up an online relationship with a Russian woman on Facebook. It was the beginning of a virtual romance that he hoped to transform into a real one. So in February 2013, he went to Moscow for the first time. Dougan, and Dougan's name is spelled Dougan. Dougan loved Moscow immediately, citing its sense of ungoverned freedom. Quote, it was like the Wild West meets New York City, unquote, he said. As for the romance, he told me he had not seen nor communicated with the woman in several years, and he declined to reveal her name. About a week after he arrived in Moscow, Dougan posted a photo on his Facebook page of himself having lunch at the Bison Steakhouse in Moscow with an unusually intriguing companion, former Kremlin official Pavel Borodin. The photo has since been removed. Up until this time, Dougan had vacillated between the worlds of a small-time huckster who created revenge fantasy websites laced with disinformation and a legitimate whistleblower decrying racism and corruption. Whether one thought Dougan was legit or a con man, everyone could all agree on one thing. In either case, in the context of world affairs, John Mark Dougan was small-time, insignificant, a nobody. But the photo he posted on Facebook suggests something else entirely. Pavel Borodin is not a familiar name to Americans, but in Russia he's a major figure. In fact, he's so close to Vladimir Putin that one has to ask why one of the most important figures in Putin's inner circle would waste time lunching with Dougan. Quote, Borodin is no small fry, unquote, says Yuri Shvets. Quote, this is the guy who brought Putin to Moscow, to the Kremlin, unquote. Dubbed, quote-unquote, Putin's mentor by Time, Borodin had overseen the Presidential Affairs Department during the Boris Yeltsin administration in the 90s, and so was in charge of the upkeep of the Russian Federation's assets. And which of Russia's assets was he overseeing, you may ask? Actually, just about all of them. As the New York Times reported, Borodin had oversight of Russia's land, Russia's farms, Russia's dachas, its automobiles, its aircraft, and its yachts, Russia's hospitals, Russia's buildings, its antiques, its art, and more. More than 200 profit-making companies, and he had oversight of things you might overlook because they didn't fit neatly into categories, such as a stake in a $12 billion Arctic diamond mine. All told, Borodin was in charge of supervising some $600 billion in assets, nearly $1 trillion in 2020 dollars. Quote, Mr. Borodin is unequivocally far and away the Russian that people would most love to bribe, unquote, the New York Times reported. Quote, forget Russia. Few people on earth have this much largesse at their fingertips, unquote. And even fewer people were in such a pivotal position at the birth of the untamed gangster capitalism in Russia and were able to do something that truly marked a turning point in world history. In 1996, at a time when efforts to develop a real market economy were failing, and Russia was devolving into a mafia state, Borodin hired Putin as his deputy and put him in a vital strategic position that allowed him to broker the new rules of a nascent kleptocracy. The relationships between the oligarchs and the Kremlin and the rise of the mafia state. It has been widely speculated in the Russian media that if anyone has kompromat on Putin, it would be Pavel Borodin from this period. And when the state prosecutors started investigating Borodin for his alleged role in a multi-million-dollar bribery and money laundering scam, Putin, who had become FSB chief by this time, showed his great loyalty to Borodin by ousting the prosecutor, Yuri Skuratov, using secret footage that allegedly showed Skuratov cavorting with prostitutes. When Putin became president in 2000, he then gave Borodin the post of state secretary of the Union of Russia and Belarus, a largely ceremonial position that had the highly valued perquisite of guaranteeing him legal immunity in Russia. Then in 2002, Borodin was convicted of money laundering by a Swiss court, and the Putin administration paid $3 million bail for his release. Immunity is a good thing to have when you have access to hundreds of billions of dollars, unquote. Now, there's a whole bunch more here, and I don't know if we want to get into this now, but while you consider that, Greg, I just want to point out that Borodin also had been charged with massive money laundering in New York, and then Putin, I believe, had also stepped in at that point. It looks like had advocated on his behalf, but then he was then released on a 5 million Swiss franc bond, and this is back in 2001, I believe. So we'll include some links that just talk about that a little bit.
This is good information. I'm interested to hear to get more into it. If you feel it's worthwhile, because this is good information, and it's linking this Dougan, this American, I guess, fancy whistleblower, kind of another maybe a law enforcement version of Scott Ritter, a maybe American grows up a cold warrior who comes to realize that his country was wrong and Russia is in the right and all this. And this is a very significant relationship for somebody like this to have. And so I think that this is worth getting into more if you feel that there's more to this discussion, because I think that this information is very worthwhile here.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to sort of flesh this out now because it may be that we don't really have time to get back to this question of Dougan and these connections and where that all went later on. So it might be just good to do that now, and then if we have to then return to finishing the proof of conspiracy chapter, I think it might even be worthwhile, because these are the networks surrounding the 11/9 cover-up, obviously. This question of Epstein, Maxwell, and Trump, especially, as it's sort of, again, coming back from the background here, but it's, obviously the front of these key Russian sphere billionaires, oligarchs, and how a lot of this ties directly into geopolitics, I think is crucial to at least lay out.
And it looks like my thinking hearing this and this connection and this it's like a it's another element of, but in this case even more directly at a very high level, directly related to Putin himself and the highest levels of the Russian government. There's a similarity here, but more interconnected at the highest levels than even than the relationships that were cultivated between Russia via a person like Maria Butina and the folks at the National Rifle Association and American politicians and Sheriff David Clark, et cetera. So this is another element of that. And Dougan, it appears to me to be interrelated. Maybe it's different at some level or another, but it seems similar. And Dougan is acting more overtly and of a Russian information propagandist than these other people who are definitely serving ends from a domestic political standpoint. But this seems an even more direct relationship with the person who has been identified, at least on a personal dinner basis, with the person who has been identified by Time magazine as Putin's mentor, um, and Dugan's more directly pushing overt Russian propaganda warfare information, even than the people within the whole National Rifle Association network that are more indirectly and covertly doing so. This is much more overt example of direct Russian friendly propaganda from a person who is moved on to Russia and then takes his relationships in American law enforcement and uses that to his advantage in this regard, while having at least a personal dinner connection to the brain of Vladimir Putin via Time magazine.
Definitely. I mean, we'll link to some of the actual, quote unquote, journalistic work that Dugan is being shown to be doing. But this is a crucial piece of this, and you'll find him Ukraine war perspective, quote unquote, journalist John Mark Dugan live. He gives his perspective and analysis on this week's car bomb assassination, and I believe the YouTube that I saw months ago was Dougan, maybe with either a Southeast Asian major media company or maybe an Indian media company doing an interview all about this. So this is not small time. He's basically went from being a dissident sheriff deputy in Florida to claiming he had the some of the Florida-based Kompromat materials from Epstein Maxwell network, going to meeting this Russian woman on Facebook, going to Russia, meeting up with one of Putin's brain, or at least a godfather to Putin from back to the Moscow days, and someone who holds a lot of networks of real hard asset power in the Russian sphere. Borodin, when he's in Russia, and then he pops up as a quote unquote journalist, towing the Russian state media line at this key moment of their invasion of Ukraine. So something going on here, something big going on here. All right. We are on page 226 of American Kompromat by Craig Unger, How the KGB Cultivated Donald Trump and Related Tales of Sex, Greed, Power, and Treachery. Quote, after Dugan's lunch with Borodin, a company called MD International Holdings put out a press release announcing that the company CEO, Mark Dougan, had traveled to Moscow, quote, to meet with Russian Secretary of State Pavel Borodin, unquote. In fact, Borodin was state secretary for the Russia-Belarus Union. The release added that, quote, Secretary Borodin presented Mr. Dougan with a very beautiful and very limited leather and gold book about the history of the Kremlin, as well as signing the book under his chapter in the book, unquote. The purpose of the meeting was said, quote, to establish cooperation in various aspects of business, including facilitating American investments into the robust Russian business environment and to engage into markets that would be considered, quote unquote, frontier to Russia, unquote. An aside here, remember that the timing of when when Dougan originally goes to Moscow. I think it's actually the same year as the Miss Universe episode of Trump in Moscow, which then is all the background of the PP tape and all of that kind of stuff. Whereas the much more overt, unquestionable relationships that were, on display in terms of that trip get defocused on. And then I'll point out too, once again, relating to our recent episodes of the Steele dossier itself, not focusing necessarily on the question of the PP tapes and whether Putin has these on Trump, but more on even the fact that it was reported to him by a source that the Trump campaign itself was happy to embrace the questions or the conspiracy theories about Trump Russia in order to avoid the even deeper and more corrupt entanglements with other countries, which it then was specifically said China, but others, right? You got to go then back to the Middle East component of the 11/9 operation. Obviously, Israel, UAE, Saudis, right? And then even beyond that too, because you'll see there's a whole background of Trump operating in many different countries, including Panama, right? The Panama Hotel. There's a whole right up there, which is real interesting. All right. And even I think there's even a connection to the Azerbaijan, I believe. And recently there's this very deep Azerbaijani Israeli connection, and it's even been said that some of these recent attacks on Iranian facilities associated with their drone program, maybe. That were actually Israeli operations being run out of Azerbaijan. But that's just an aside, and I don't know exactly all about that. Okay. But you have Dougan in Moscow 2013 originally, Trump, key moment 2013, Moscow. So, all right, back to the text. Bottom of page 226 of American Kompromat by Craig Unger. Quote, an internet search on the Wayback Machine suggests that MD International Holdings was not really a going concern and that its site may have been constructed for the sole purpose of publicizing Dougan's meeting with Borodin. So what was a big fish like Borodin doing with a small fry like Dougan? According to Dougan, the meeting was perfectly innocent and Borodin was just another Facebook friend. Quote, I wanted to start a business in Russia. I started looking at Facebook profiles and saw that this person was sitting in front of the Russian parliament, unquote, he told a Russian reporter. Quote, I added him as a friend and started chatting with him on Facebook. I asked him to meet. When you are American, it's easy to organize meetings with people, unquote. Sure. The man Vladimir Putin trusted to oversee more than $600 billion in assets was sitting around waiting for a former Palm Beach deputy to become his Facebook friend. That makes lots of sense.
Yeah, um, it has about as much believability on my believability scale as billionaire Foster Freeze being so impressed by college kid Charlie Kirk's ideas for the future of America that he gives him, what was it, $20 million to kickstart Turning Point USA? It reminds me of that.
Yeah, it even can remind you of like the origin stories of the Israeli military intelligence Lakam operative Arnon Milchan financed JFK film, including the sort of the bumping into people at a conference involved with Covert Action Quarterly, very well recognized to have been backed by KGB. Even to with the ignorance of some of its involved assets there apparently, and then them handing Stone the idea for the movie and a lot of the materials and sort of heading him in that direction. And then just sort of, maybe Oliver Stone just sort of like was, wondering who could finance this film. And, oh, yeah, Arnon Milchan, there you go. So it has that kind of, flavor of being blind to espionage, the actual workings of cultivation and espionage and real deep geopolitically motivated informational operations to the tune of, millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, in order to protect the kinds of assets that are, in the trillions of dollars potentially, or even bigger than that if you're thinking about, war and peace and that kind of thing.
I will say on the topic of Foster Friesen, the seed money, it was definitely, I don't think it was $20 million. It was probably in the thousands. I made a exaggeration on that point there, just not thinking so. But it did turn into way more than that. And it was an example of this chance encounter with this very influential person who can put you on the map, and rather unrealistic sounding version of events of being sold on your vision for the future of America so much that you just give thousands of dollars of seed money. But from the perspective of what we're discussing here directly, Jeremy, your comparison of the manuscript for what became JFK, Oliver Stone's JFK, financed by Arnon Milchan at a conference involving covert affairs people in Cuba, is more apt for this geopolitical element we're going at here with relation to the geopolitics of all this. I think that was an even more apt comparison, and definitely a couple of examples that I think on the surface don't exactly pass my smell test as far as entirely believable versions of events here.
Definitely, and the proof is in the pudding in terms of the actual information result of that film. It's crucial. It was the key to sort of reconsidering a JFK assassination research after it sort of like maybe died down a little bit from the original push that ended up actually, getting parts of the U.S. government to reopen these kinds of cases, including RFK and MLK, JFK. And then ultimately, this Oliver Stone movie delivers, yeah, something that you might sort of might be of interest to both of the what we can see in the origin stories of it in terms of some kind of Soviet KGB assisted dissident group in the United States, where it sort of ends up being unnamed, shadowy figures at the replete throughout the entire top tier of the corrupt American government system, of the military industrial complex and the CIA. None of them really named did this to the American president, and then that's then of course bolstered by the executive producer angle of this, Arnon Milchan working on behalf, I would assert, of his long-term agenthood as a member of Israeli military intelligence key material acquire Lacom, the Bureau of Scientific Relations, where it's said in one of Milchan's biographies that he was a key figure to acquire missing material, military material for the Israelis' security state in terms of nuclear, biological, chemical. This is the actual financier, the backer, the backstop of the actual Oliver Stone film, which very conveniently then leaves out uh, the entire question of means, motive, and opportunity in relationship to the Israeli state interests, which have to do with Kennedy and Ben Gurion and the nuclear weapons question, and Kennedy's desire to not abandon Israel in terms of security, actually to bring Israel under the nuclear umbrella of the United States in the Cold War, but to actually create what it looks like Kennedy thought was a much more secure situation by creating a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. And so that all of that piece is then also missing.
Right. And it, it's no accident, in my view, that this becomes what all popular culture relating to Kennedy assassination always goes back to, is either the movie JFK itself or other things, other elements of research and takes on the assassination that basically are, in the modern context, are rooted from that. It doesn't seem to be an accident to me that this is what led to that, of course, with the very powerful Hollywood figure of Arnon Milchan at play. And then this kind of cemented Oliver Stone's it might be a bit of a shifting from making more traditional films to with meaning behind them as they were, like Platoon. But I digress into the this might have been the beginning of Oliver Stone becoming like the propagandist that we see him as now. Basically, that's what I consider him as far as within the Russian sphere of influence, combined with his films, even about places such as Venezuela, which, with the benefit of hindsight, I do think play a propaganda role for certain narratives that are out there, as well as his Showtime miniseries about the secret history of the United States, which a big part of that was the the Russians didn't get credit for winning the war, and then everything since then has been to have hegemony over the world at the expense of Russia. So there's definitely a career path you could see there with Stone. I think that he was already a prominent name before, but then coming out of this film, like, he really cements himself, like, with his what people consider him as now, of the conspiracy theorist who makes Russian propaganda.
Definitely, and now with the very recent release of Stone go coming back into the realm of Kennedy assassination research, he in the last year or so he released the documentary that they made about it. That seems to me, now we still haven't seen it, and I think that we probably need to see it. But it's only at this time that Stone has even begun addressing the questions of the missing Israeli motive, means, opportunity, and I still believe it is the case that no one, including someone like Abby Martin, who got an interview with Oliver Stone, has actually put the question to Oliver Stone of Arnon Milchan. How did that happen? What did it potentially mean? The relationship with Arnon Milchan's background as an agent of Israeli military intelligence, and then how that then might relate to what was not in that film. And then when you combine that with what you pointed out about where now we're in the day where Oliver Stone is pretty obviously the most effective Western presenter of Vladimir Putin and his side of the story, you might say, and he's the most effective journalist from the West in terms of getting long form, multiple sit down interviews with Putin, and then actually creating these quote unquote documentaries about Ukraine that are mainly seem to feature the line from Russian sphere Ukrainian oligarchs and then Putin himself, alongside being done with what looks to be some real, totally non credible kind of actual filmmaking and backing behind it, is what it looks like to me. So I agree with you, Greg. Like, now, looking from our contemporary moment, the question of Oliver Stone and the origins of the JFK film have even more overwrought meaning, I think, in terms of how he's ended up.
Yeah, and then you even think of another geopolitical angle would be what we've pointed out a number of times over the last few years. Arnon Milchan's best friend in Hollywood was the producer Andrew Vajna, who helped Viktor Orban consolidate the media in Hungary after Orban comes back into power in the early 2010s with a shift in his um, governance from more centrist to more, seems overtly Russian-friendly direction, and some of the question marks surrounding that evolution potentially there that we've talked about before regarding even bags of money for Semyon Mogilevich and all of that. So from a geopolitical strand, when you throw that in there, it becomes, I think, that there's more of a geopolitical significance than just the Milhan Israeli intelligence, but it makes it more intriguing geopolitically overall with that connection, and then Stone in there and this close friendship.
And wherever you see this Milchan Netanyahu network at play, whether it's actually in Israel and Milchan's role in the criminal corruption charges against Netanyahu, and how Netanyahu's now making his move against the judiciary, or if it's Milchan's right hand man in Hungary, Andi Vanya, and his role with Orban in consolidating the media, you really do see, what would have to be called anti-democratic, authoritarian type forces. And so that then then that's just on the surface of it, and then as you pointed out, there's this lingering question around the actual background of Orban's turn and the question of Semyon Mogilevich and the suitcases, right? Remember the counterintelligence acronym for how one is turned into an asset and or an agent, right? MICE, MICE, money, ideology, compromise, or ego, right? And sometimes there are multiples of those are operating, and so this is this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of espionage. And then one final or questionable origin story or interesting origin story that popped into my mind when you started bringing this up, Greg, is the question of the Trump key Deutsche Bank sector banker Rosemary Vrablick, who was running also, remember, this is also where the Justice Kennedy, Anthony Kennedy, with the mobbed up background of his father from California politics, and then his role in leading the opinion on the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court that opened up the floodgates of billions of dollars of dark money operating to this day, or then his son Justin Kennedy's key position in this specific Deutsche Bank unit that was the backer of Donald Trump, and Rosemary Vrablick being this key Deutsche Bank figure there. And her origin story is how she got into banking via train ride down from upstate New York somewhere, and then happened to sit next to a key executive from one of the most major Israeli banks. I think it was Bank Leumi, I believe. I might have gotten that wrong, but that's the origin story for Rosemary Vrablick, how she gets into banking and how she ultimately ended up at this key position at Deutsche Bank was a happenstance of sitting on the train next to a key Israeli bank executive. So that may be true, but it's usually suggestive of a much deeper story, I would say. All right, back into the text of Craig Unger's American Kompromat. We are on page 227. I'll just reread this paragraph. Quote, sure, the man Vladimir Putin trusted to oversee more than $600 billion in assets was sitting around waiting for a former Palm Beach deputy to become his Facebook friend. That makes lots of sense. When I asked Yuri Shvets what he thought of Dougan's narrative, he laughed. By the way, Yuri Shvets is one of the main sources around certain background aspects of Russian and Soviet intelligence for Unger's American Kompromat, and Shvets had inside knowledge of the American workings of the KGB at specific times, actually during the 80s, the New York epicenter. Remember this whole question of Trump purchasing all these televisions for his hotel from what was well known to be a KGB front electronics shop that his buddy Sam Kislin, who's also Rudy Giuliani's buddy, was linked into. So there's that whole background, and Shvets was an inside observer of a lot of this time. And like we pointed out last time, Netanyahu in the 80s at the UN, surrounding all this is Jonathan Pollard, which then had certain kind of background Soviet intelligence questions. At the very least, this is when the Soviet penetration of high levels of U.S. intelligence was becoming apparent, and leads ultimately into questions of Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen and all of that, or even into the question of the fourth man in terms of Bob Baer's recent book. But then I would then again point the finger all the way back to the question of James Jesus Angleton sitting at the head of U.S. counterintelligence and the Israel desk at these key moments of assassinations and the solidifying of the relationship and the muddying of the waters and running U.S. counterintelligence into a wall. Sort of similar, but at a much bigger scale of what McGonigal seems to have had some kind of role in terms of his role at FBI and counterintelligence around the 11/9 operation. So history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? All right. Back to the text, page 227 of American Kompromat by Craig Unger. This is Yuri Shvets. Quote, "It's like two needles meet each other in a haystack," he said. Pavel Borodin is searching Facebook, waiting until the guy comes from Florida to Moscow. This is what I would trust. The guy with a massive collection of video comes to Moscow and he gets in touch with Borodin and the FSB. That is what is happening. Dougan is in the selling business, unquote. And as for Borodin, he is in the buying business. Quote, Putin was a nobody until Borodin brought him to Moscow. So that means Borodin has direct contact with the Kremlin, with the FSB, unquote. According to Neil Barnett, Dougan presented himself as a ripe target for recruitment by the FSB, and his first trip to Moscow, quote, would have allowed Russian intelligence to fully recruit Dougan. It is likely that they presented the quote-unquote cooperation as a way for them to support his campaign against the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office, and that they slipped in requests relating to Epstein as an apparent afterthought or contextual manner, unquote. When he returned to Palm Beach, Dougan moved on to other matters. He continued to have a relationship with his Russian girlfriend for a period of time during which each of them made 2 or 3 trips between Moscow and Palm Beach. At the same time, he says, Joe Recarey continued to give him more documents from the Epstein investigation through 2015. Meanwhile, Dougan also escalated his war with the local powers that be. It became increasingly sophisticated. Over the next 3 years, he played email pranks on politicians, disseminated fake news, and created a website to show how to keep the FBI from accessing a computer. Quote, he became adept at creating fake news sites to propagate false stories, unquote, said Barnett. Quote, he also apparently worked out how to reverse engineer access to confidential data, which he then released in order to cause maximum damage. It appears that he benefited from the assistance of more sophisticated people, unquote. But in his book about his adventures, Bad Wolf, Dougan insists that he is not an asset of the Russian government, nor has it tried to recruit him. In an interview with the Daily Mail, Dougan also asserted that he has not shared any materials with the Russian government and that he does not intend to blackmail anyone with his information. End of section. Into the last section of this chapter. We're on page 228 of American Kompromat by Craig Unger. Quote, by March 2016, however, Dougan's massive doxing rampage had apparently gone too far. Early in the morning of March 14, 2016, Dougan woke up and fed breakfast to his 2 kids as they prepared for school. As Dougan himself describes it in Bad Wolf, at the front door he noticed a black Ford FX2 pickup truck idling in front of his house. The pickup had black tinted windows, which are illegal in Florida, and suggested to him that the truck was an undercover vehicle. Dougan went back indoors, put on a shirt, and went outside to see what they were doing. The truck's doors opened. FBI agents wearing tactical vests burst out. Agents started coming out of the bushes behind buildings everywhere. Within moments, Dougan was cuffed and on the ground. One agent immediately grabbed Dougan's cell phone and passed it to another, quote, presumably because they knew my phone was encrypted and had to act fast to ensure they could suck all the data out of it before it locked, unquote. Before long, the FBI began wheeling in machinery, which Dougan surmised had, quote, portable batteries and an inverter that would enable the FBI to keep the computer running while they unplugged it. That way they could extrapolate the encryption key at a later date, unquote. One of the agents asked, quote, who are your Russian friends? You should tell us because it's going to be a lot easier if you tell us what we want to know, unquote. They seized his passport and put him on the no-fly list, so no commercial air travel or private travel outside the country was possible. The raid, he said, was, quote, the most significant, quote-unquote, holy shit moment of my life, unquote. As for the so-called Epstein videos, what about them? According to Dougan, when the FBI seized his computers in 2016, they got everything Recarey had given him. If Dougan's videos were the real deal, that meant that the FBI had possession of Jeffrey Epstein's prize Kompromat, and with it the secrets of the most powerful men in the world. When the FBI finally left and had not arrested him, Dougan knew his troubles weren't over. So 9 days later, on March 23, 2016, he went down to Isla Morada Key in South Florida, about 150 miles south of Palm Beach, and rented an 18-foot boat from Bud and Mary's Marina. He intended not to return the boat, but instead to embark on a spectacularly dangerous 300-mile trip to Cuba on the, quote, barely buoyant shitbox, unquote, as he referred to it. Before he took off, however, Dougan noticed a handful of FBI agents at the marina on his tail. Dougan immediately realized that meant even if he were able to survive the stormy seas, the FBI would have Homeland Security or the Coast Guard on him in no time. That meant it was on to Plan B. Now that he realized he was still under such intense surveillance, Dougan deactivated all his mobile devices, including a burner phone he had bought. In Bad Wolf, Dougan's account of what happened next as he escaped from the United States is brief, but it is full of holes. Quote, a few days after I left the marina, he writes, I donned a blonde wig on my bald head and a pair of light prescription glasses, evading capture by the FBI and fleeing from the United States. After renting a small plane and faking a medical emergency to slip into Canada, I made my way to Toronto. I flew Turkish Airlines to Moscow, where I became the fourth American in history to obtain political asylum in Russia, unquote. Before Dougan, Edward Snowden had been the most recent. He arrived in Russia on April 6 or 7, he told me, and applied for asylum a few days later. Quote, it took a few days for me to get my head on straight and apply for asylum, unquote. According to Barnett, Dougan's departure from the United States bore all the hallmarks of, quote, a professional exfiltration plan put together by an intelligence service. First, Dougan got a car with no documented connection to him and drove it to the Canadian border. He then chartered a light aircraft to overfly Canada. During the flight, he claimed he was having a heart attack and then ran off when the pilot made an emergency landing. From Toronto, he bought a ticket to Istanbul, and from Istanbul, bought a new ticket to Moscow, unquote. And full unquote, I just want to point out remember this very lightly covered and paid attention to story of the days in the lead up to the FBI arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell at her compound in New Hampshire, that off the coast, the North Shore kid of like the Boston area, where she had been living with the head of Cargometrics, Scott Borgerson, for a while before she went to New Hampshire. It looks like, and it looks like she actually purchased the place in New Hampshire with the actual acting help and potentially some kind of backing of Borgerson himself. Borgerson calls Cargometrics, which has backers by high-level, very intense Israeli state billionaire oligarchs. He calls it the NSA of Cargometrics. Right on the days before the FBI was to arrest Maxwell in New Hampshire, a yacht appeared off the coast of the North Shore of Boston there, and it belonged to Alexander Moshkovich, I believe. And now there's a whole background history there that we won't go into, but this is, Russian, Israeli, organized crime oligarch sphere networks that are popping up in relationship to that question of why did Alexander Moshkovich's yacht appear in the days before the Maxwell arrest in New Hampshire off the North Shore of Boston, very close to where Maxwell had been staying with Borgerson. So you begin to understand that there are, this would be seen as a cutout of some kind of intelligence operation, potentially of Maxwell making an escape via this oligarch's yacht, right? So there are these kinds of, surroundings of what is being, called an intelligence-laden escape by an exfiltration by Dougan. Now, if there was potential for exfiltration plans for Dougan, obviously even Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell, would be way higher priority and asset by maybe similar kinds of networks about exfiltrating her before she got into the maws of the aspects of the U.S. justice system in that way. So I just wanted to point out, these potential similarities of exfiltration plans. All right. We are on page 230 of American Kompromat by Craig Unger. Quote, and why Moscow? Quote, there are very few governments around the world that the U.S. won't mess with, and that the U.S. can't somehow strong-arm into returning a political dissident, unquote, he told a Russian reporter. Quote, Russia happens to be one of them, and I can't think of another government that's more powerful that would protect me, unquote. And indeed, on arrival, Dougan was granted temporary asylum in Russia, which was later changed to permanent status. When I talked to him, he added a rhetorical question. Quote, where else am I going to go that my country can't extradite me back? You've got North Korea, you've got Africa, China, forget it. I like this country very much, unquote. And what about the Kompromat? In confiscating Dougan's computers, the FBI and the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office now presumably had copies of the Epstein videos that Dougan says Rocari had brought to him for safekeeping. Dougan told me he had paid scant attention to the files Rocari had left with him, and on the rare occasion when he opened a video file, all he saw was footage of an empty room with coverage from an old-fashioned, low-resolution closed-circuit TV camera. Quote, you have to remember in those days CCTV was poor quality, and some of the earlier files had the telltale signs that they were burned to the discs from VHS tapes, unquote. And when I asked if I could see any of the files, he demurred and said he was not going to broadcast child pornography over the internet. Because the tape sessions regularly began with the camera surveying an empty room, Dougan says he never saw any activity and assumed they were ordinary surveillance videos. Nevertheless, he told me that he knew the files were about Epstein, so he made an extra set, which would have made him an extraordinarily valuable asset to the Russians. Quote, if Dougan really has these videotapes, they would be priceless, unquote, said Yuri Shvets. Quote, hundreds of videotapes with famous people in the United States with underage girls. It's hardcore kompromat, unquote. Because of their value, Dougan claims he took extraordinary precautions. Quote, the FBI and other intelligence agencies may be surprised to have discovered that I kept an off-site backup that was sent to me in 2017, after I was safely established in Russia, unquote. Initially, he says he put all the Epstein videos into a TrueCrypt container, which moved from server to server over the years as insurance that the data would stay fresh and safe from data loss. When TrueCrypt discontinued its software in 2014, Dougan switched to VeraCrypt, V-E-R-A crypt, and rotated encrypted backups on a regular basis. Later, he says he distributed the data to unidentified contacts who did not know each other and who lived on 5 different continents and are unable to read the files because they do not have the decryption keys. Quote, I do not have a physical copy in my immediate possession because of security reasons, unquote, he told me. Quote, this is to make sure my family and friends remain safe. I have made arrangements that it can only be decrypted in the event of my arrest. If I go missing for an extended time, or in case of my unusual or untimely demise, I have a system in place to connect people with the encrypted containers to those who have the decryption keys, unquote. According to the Daily Mail, quote, Dougan, who said he has received death threats since fleeing the United States, added that he had no intention of ever revealing the content stored on encrypted drives. Quote, I am not going to reveal them, and I am not going to blackmail anyone. If I give them up, then I lose all my leverage, and I do not want that to happen, unquote, full unquote. In other words, the Kompromat was perfectly safe. unless, of course, the FBI, the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office, Ghislaine, Maxwell, or some other unidentified parties could break the codes. And of course, there was the question of whether Dougan had made a deal with the FSB. For all the indications that he may be a con man or an eccentric, in Britain, MI6 was taking Dougan very seriously, indeed as someone who may be working directly with Russian intelligence. The chief reason the Daily Mail reported in September 2019 had to do with his meeting with Pavel Borodin. The paper cited a Western intelligence source saying that Dougan had all the classic traits that made him vulnerable to recruitment by, quote, a hostile intelligence service, unquote. It also noted that, quote, his knowledge of the Epstein case would have been of great interest to Russian intelligence, unquote. But the fate of the Kompromat remained uncertain. Full unquote, end of chapter. And by the way, the next chapter, chapter 16 in American Kompromat, is about the lawyers. Right. So there's a whole piece there. And as we pointed out last time, that this Tikva organization that helped sponsor the Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson brouhaha in Jerusalem, alongside Trump's attorney, right, Friedman, that Tikva is their board includes a Jeffrey Epstein lawyer, Jay Lefkowitz, but it seems to be headed by ultra notorious neocon Elliot Abrams. So there's a whole bunch more here, but we'll leave it there for now, and we will then return to finishing up the last portion of the Proof of Conspiracy. I believe it's chapter 4 by Seth Abramson, that will then really tie us directly back to the 11/9 operation and its cover-up.
Yeah, and for me, it's, I have no idea what is contained that Dougan has or says he has, and who has or has not seen anything. But it's I don't know, it's a bit hard to believe that if this information is there, in Dougan, that it hasn't been shared in some capacity with people who could use it. But at the very least, this would make him very, very valuable. This information would, at the very least, and then you combine that with clearly he's doing a service for the Russian state at some level with his the bio warfare biolabs promotion through his blog and through international interviews, as you mentioned, Jeremy. And the other thing I'll point out is that the raid in 2016 and in Florida, and I guess I was under the assumption that he had left for Russia, and that wasn't the case, at least not as of 2016. He was in Florida, and that reminded me of like these cases of these raids. It's one of those cases where those are done to maybe signal boost or give street cred, quote unquote, to some extent or another. Obviously, a very prominent example of that would be Roger Stone being raided at 5:30 in the morning, and CNN was tipped off that he'd be there and all that. But then, from another course of what more directly we're talking about here, I was thinking about the quote unquote harassment that New Horizon attendees were said to be facing coming back from Iraq with interaction with law enforcement. I believe Michael Maloof had interaction. There's a
You mean coming back from Iran?
Iran, I'm sorry. Yes, Iran. Michael Maloof had interaction. There was a September 11th activist, Sander Hicks, I believe his name is, who talked about interactions with law enforcement after the New Horizon conference. And much like that, there's this precedent, though it reminds me that and this might be the case with Dougan or not, whether the participants know it or not, this trip to Iran, I think the evidence increasingly points to, and we're still going to go back into the New Horizon as it relates to this angle with the book, interconnected with the book War for Eternity in our discussions about Alexander Dougan. And we're going to go back into that here in one of our future shows bit more of a deep dive into New Horizon itself. But there's a bit of like a bit of a street cred building for like, hey, we're the ones being persecuted, we're being harassed and all this by the forces of the state. And then once you really peel beneath the layers, you see that whether the participants realize it or not, this is not just this innocuous, innocent event that you're going to in a foreign country to discuss policy and no, it's very clearly part of a higher level, ultimately warfare on an international scale going on against the United States as a society, a Western society. And so similar to that, I see Dougan, that this raid, like the precedent that we know of with like the things like New Horizon, it shows me that there's and I think even with Dougan there's more evidence, but there's definitely like these are not just random events to go after the patriots who are trying to get the truth out, that there's more to this than this. And there was smoke to the fire, so to speak, to say the least, is what the precedent that is set with these types of events. And regardless of if the ends always justify the means or not, these are not just people taking part in innocent foreign excursions, to say the least.
Yeah, two final points that I'd like to make, and one is related to what you were just talking about, which would be then I would point out the both timing and location in relationship to this raid of Dougan, because there's two main locations that would potentially tie together Epstein and Trump. There'd have to be New York FBI, and then Florida, right? Florida located FBI. In terms of the deeper history there, because right, if these are a fairly full archive of older audiovisual from Epstein in Florida, this would then go back to the time pre the Epstein-Trump breakup over their real estate deal, apparently. This would then flip by Donald Trump to Rybolovlev, key Russian sphere fertilizer oligarch who followed Trump's campaign around with his private plane in 2016. So that's the place, right? Obviously, but that's where Dougan is. That's why he's important to the story, right? He comes out of Palm Beach Sheriff's Office. But then think about the timing of this. And this is very likely right around the time that someone like Katie Johnson began to file her cases. And now she did it on her own, I think, and she filed her first case in California, and it was the wrong venue and all of that. But that happened right around this time, I think, somewhere in the spring of 2016, and then ultimately the successfully filed suit comes back in the fall of 2016 before it's then dropped. So you could almost imagine some kind of scenario where Dougan is being flushed out, actually, right? He's being triggered to flee to some extent as an additional aspect or an analysis of what you're talking about, of not only sort of raising the profile or creating a kind of a dissident media painting of someone like Roger Stone in that case that you laid out, but like a Dougan over the longer term in terms of an Epstein whistleblower dissident, American dissident. He's flushed out at a very specific time, it looks like, in terms of the run up to the key aspect of the 2016 campaign. We're now at the time of where it's like Arthur Finkelstein is in the mix in terms of Trump and how they're going to get Trump really ensconced in there, right? And so there's that piece. So I think that's interesting. And then the second piece of this is, again, the proof is in the pudding when it comes to the question of, is Dougan an asset of the Russian government to some extent? And it reminds me a lot of like what we pointed out, the missing analysis of people like Robbie and Abby Martin from the 2016 I think it ultimately was published in 2017, the National Intelligence Estimate of the question of Russian media in relationship to the 2016 elections, and the quotes that were attributed to the head of RT, Margaret Simonian, where she basically seems to, basically forecast what ultimately becomes of Russian state media years down the line when kinetic war goes live in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. She basically says that when we are at war, we are a weapon of the government. Russia today goes from being an interesting sort of dissident press platform for dissidents from around the world within their own countries to becoming a weapon system for the Russian government. What else should we do? She said, we have to be patriots, right? And so I think the proof is in the pudding in terms of, Dougan goes from being some kind of, dissident trying to lay low in Moscow, but sort of, running into this Pavel Borodin key guy, but he's just trying to start a business and keep his head down, to becoming a media asset, a media spokesperson for the Russian state when the war goes live. So I think the proof is in the pudding in terms of what exactly Dougan is doing here. And also, like, there's this legitimate claim that he's making that keeping this all. He's not actually being the Epstein dissident whistleblower that he said he was, and that he sort of set up to be by certain other alternative media angles. So he's going to disclose the truth that the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office and the FBI are covering up. No, that's ultimately his kompromat that he has in terms of protecting himself and his family. Now, that's a legitimate explanation for why he doesn't release it, but I don't actually buy it. And I agree with you, Greg. I imagine that there's some kind of quid pro quo in relationship to him being obviously some kind of not only protected asset in terms of living in Russia in safety over the long term, but then being actually taking on this role of a major media spokesperson on behalf of Russian state interests. So obviously, there's some kind of quid pro quo going on here that I imagine does not involve Dougan keeping all of those files to himself. Now, what he may mean is I'm not going to release them publicly to the entire world's public for the nature of public interest, but I will, give them to who I need to in order to protect me. And then I'll have this as my more generalized, kompromat against people who might want to hurt me down the road. All right. Until next time, thank you very much, Greg. Thank you, everybody out there. We appreciate you. Antidote. We are out.